My grandmother stepped out of a Rolls-Royce in a military commissary parking lot and watched me swipe a WIC voucher to pay for baby formula. She stood there in her cream Chanel suit diamonds, catching the fluorescent light, and asked me a question that would tear my entire family apart. "Isn't $200,000 a month enough for you?" I looked at her confused, exhausted my daughter crying in the cart beside me, and I said the only thing I could say. "Grandma, I've never received a single dollar in my life." That was the moment everything changed. I want you to picture me the way I actually was that Tuesday morning, because it matters. I wasn't dressed up. I wasn't trying to look like anything other than what I was. I had on my OCPs, the ones with the faded patch on the shoulder, because I'd washed them so many times the thread had started to give. My hair was pulled back tight the way they teach you in basic, and you never really stop doing even years later. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in about 6 weeks, not since Emma decided that 2 in the morning was her favorite time to be awake. It was my day off. Fort Campbell was quiet in that particular way military posts get quiet, like even the buildings are catching their breath. I'd pushed the cart into the commissary with Emma strapped into the little seat gnawing on her fist, and I'd gone straight for the formula aisle because we were down to our last can, and I'd been doing math in my head since the night before. WIC covers a certain brand, not always the one that's in stock. I remember standing there scanning the shelf, feeling that specific tightness in my chest that comes from watching every dollar before you spend it when I heard the sound of a car door outside that didn't belong on a military installation. Rolls-Royces don't pull up to commissaries, not the kind I'd been shopping at for 3 years. I looked up out of habit more than curiosity, and there she was. My grandmother Eleanor Marshall walking through those glass doors like she owned the building, which, in a roundabout way through the family holding company, she basically did. She was 78 years old, and she still moved like a woman who'd never once doubted she belonged in any room she walked into. Cream suit pearls, silver hair, set perfectly. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 years. Not since Emma's father's funeral, actually, when she'd stood at the back of the chapel and I'd been too numb with grief to do more than nod at her from across the room. She saw me before I could decide whether to duck down another aisle. Her eyes went from my face to the cart to Emma, and then I watched this happen in real time down to the voucher booklet still in my hand, the paper kind, the kind you can't miss if you know what it is. And she knew exactly what it was. Her face did something I'd never seen it do before. Confusion, then disbelief, like her mind was trying to reject what her eyes were telling her. "Vivian!" She said my name carefully, like she was testing whether I was really standing there. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" "Buying formula, Grandma." I tried to keep my voice light. I even managed something like a smile, because that's what you do. You smile and you keep moving. That's the whole trick to surviving. She stepped closer and I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that didn't belong anywhere near the smell of a commissary. Her eyes went to the voucher again, and I watched her put it together, watched the math happen behind her eyes, even though the math didn't make any sense to her. "Isn't $200,000 a month enough for you?" she asked. I actually laughed, one short, confused sound, because I genuinely thought she had to be joking, or she had me confused with someone else, some other granddaughter I didn't know I had. "I'm sorry, what?" "The trust." She said it slower this time, like maybe I hadn't heard her right. "Your grandfather's trust. 200,000 a month, Vivian. It's been running since you turned 18. Are you telling me?" She stopped herself. I watched something shift in her face, the confusion sharpening into something colder, something more alert. I set my hand on the edge of the cart to steady myself because the floor felt like it had tilted underneath me. "Grandma, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never gotten a check from anybody. Not $1. I live on E4 pay. That's it. That's all there's ever been." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Emma made a small sound in her seat, oblivious gumming at her fist, and I reached over automatically to brush her hair back, needing something to do with my hands, because I could feel the ground shifting under a life I thought I understood. "Say that again," Eleanor said very quietly now, and there was nothing soft left in her voice at all. "Tell me exactly what you just told me." So I did. I told her about the double shifts, about clipping coupons, about the nights I split a can of soup because I wanted Emma to have the good formula instead of the store brand. I told her about the used Corolla with the check engine light I couldn't afford to look at. I told her I had never, not once in 10 years, seen a cent from any trust, and that I hadn't even known one existed. By the time I finished, her hands were shaking. Not from age. From fury I would understand later, a fury so total it had gone past heat and turned to ice. She pulled her phone from her purse right there in the formula aisle, dialed a number without even looking at the screen, and when the call connected, her voice came out flat and lethal in a way I had never heard from her before. "Daniel, cancel every meeting on my calendar today. I want every trust document, every statement, every signature on my desk within the hour." A pause. "Yes, all of it. Something is very wrong, and I intend to find out exactly what." She hung up and looked at me, and for the first time in my life, my grandmother looked at me like she was seeing me clearly. "Get your daughter," she said. "You're coming with me." I didn't argue with her. There wasn't really room to. Eleanor Marshall had a way of making decisions for the people around her that felt less like control and more like gravity. You just went along with it because resisting seemed to cost more energy than it was worth. She had a driver waiting, a quiet man named Thomas, who'd worked for the family longer than I'd been alive, and he loaded Emma's car seat into the back of a black SUV that smelled like leather and cedar. Nothing like the inside of my Corolla, which smelled like spilled formula and old coffee, no matter how many times I cleaned it. I sat in the back with Emma on my lap because I hadn't thought to bring the bass she clicked into, and Eleanor sat across from us, staring out the window with her jaw set in a way I recognized from old photographs of her running board meetings in the 80s. She didn't say much on the ride. I think she was doing the same thing I was doing, which was trying to rebuild a version of the last 10 years that made sense with this new piece of information sitting in the middle of it like a stone dropped into still water. I want to back up here because to understand how any of this was possible, you have to understand what my family actually was. I grew up mostly in my grandparents' orbit. My mother died when I was 9, a car accident on a wet road outside Nashville. Nothing dramatic, just one of those senseless things that rearranges a child's whole world in the space of an afternoon. My father, Richard, was never what you'd call present even before that. He was the kind of man who loved the idea of being a father more than the actual daily work of it. After my mother died, he remarried within 2 years. Linda came into our lives with a smile that never quite reached past her mouth, and from the very first dinner I understood in the particular clear-eyed way children understand these things, that I was not going to be a priority in that house. So I spent my afternoons and most of my summers at my grandparents' estate instead. My grandfather, Thomas Marshall Sr., built Marshall Industries from a single manufacturing plant into something that employed thousands of people across 4 states. He was a hard man in business, and a soft one with me, the kind of contradiction only a certain generation of self-made men seem to carry. He used to sit me on the porch and tell me that money was only worth what it protected, and that the people who forgot that always ended up alone with a great deal of it. When I turned 18 right before he passed, he set up a trust in my name. $200,000 a month funded by his personal holdings outside the company meant to give me a foundation no matter what happened with the family business. He named my father as the trustee, the administrator, because I was young, and it seemed practical at the time. Richard was supposed to manage the disbursements until I was old enough to take it over myself, or until certain conditions were met. He was never supposed to touch the principal. He was never supposed to touch any of it. Really, his job was to make sure it reached me. When I enlisted at 19, my father barely blinked. I remember standing in his study telling him I'd signed with an army recruiter, half expecting some kind of reaction, some flicker of the father I used to believe he could be. Instead, he looked up from his desk, unimpressed, and said, "The army can take care of you now." That was it. That was the whole conversation. I told myself it didn't hurt. I have told myself that a lot of things didn't hurt. By the time we reached the Marshall Industries building downtown, Eleanor had already texted her lawyer twice. Daniel met us in the private elevator lobby, a tall man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up into thinning gray hair, carrying a leather folder so thick it looked like it might split at the spine. He didn't smile. He barely looked at me. He looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who already knew what he was about to say was going to detonate something. 10 years, he said, once we were behind the closed doors of Eleanor's office. Emma finally asleep against my shoulder. 10 years of disbursements, all processed, all documented as delivered. Not $1 traces to an account in Vivian's name. Eleanor's hands were folded on the desk in front of her perfectly still, which somehow frightened me more than if she'd been shaking. Then where did it go, Daniel? He laid out the papers one at a time like he was dealing cards in a game none of us wanted to be playing. Shell companies, consulting fees paid to entities that didn't seem to consult on anything. Transfers routed through 3 different holding accounts before landing eventually in accounts tied directly to my father. Every single authorization carried his signature. I sat there holding my sleeping daughter, and I felt something strange happen inside my chest, not rage exactly, not yet more like the floor of a house I'd been standing on my whole life, quietly giving way board by board, and me only now realizing how far down the fall was going to be. He stole from his own daughter, Eleanor said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was something in the stillness of it that was worse than shouting a kind of controlled devastation, that I understood even then was the sound of a woman rebuilding herself around a fact she could not unknow. She stood up from her chair, smoothed the front of her jacket with 2 hands, and looked at Daniel. "Have the helicopter ready in 20 minutes, she said. "I want to see my son's face when I ask him where my granddaughter's money went." I remember looking down at Emma's small, sleeping face, thinking about every can of formula I'd rationed, every night shift I'd picked up so I could afford daycare, every time I'd told myself that struggling was simply what being a young single mother in the army looked like. And somewhere across town my father was living a life built brick by brick, dollar by dollar on the money that should have kept my daughter fed. The helicopter ride gave me too much time to think, which is never a good thing when your entire understanding of your family has just been rewritten in the space of a single afternoon. Emma slept through most of it, curled against me with the noise-canceling headset Thomas had found for her, tiny and stunned-looking in that way infants get when the world has decided to be loud around them. I watched the Tennessee hills fold into subdivisions, and then into the kind of neighborhoods where the houses don't have neighbors, so much as estates gated and green and set so far back from the road you'd never guess what was hiding behind the hedges. My father's house came into view like something out of a magazine spread, because it basically was one Linda had gotten it featured twice in a regional lifestyle publication. Something I only knew because she'd mailed me a copy once unprompted years ago, like a woman leaving a calling card. 6,000 square feet of glass and white stone, a pool shaped like a lagoon, a boathouse down at the private dock where his 60-foot yacht sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. I'd been there exactly 4 times since I enlisted. Each visit felt like touring a museum exhibit titled "The Life I Was Never Invited Into." Eleanor didn't want to confront him yet. That surprised me coming from a woman who'd been ready to detonate her whole family an hour earlier. But she wanted to see, she said. She wanted to understand what 10 years of a stolen inheritance actually looked like when you built a life out of it before she said a single word to the man who'd built it. So we didn't announce ourselves as accusers. We arrived as guests because Linda was hosting one of her charity luncheons that afternoon, the kind with a string quartet and a step-and-repeat banner for the local news to photograph raising money. I would learn later with a bitterness that still catches in my throat for a children's hospital fund. I stood at the edge of that party in my uniform because I hadn't had time to change, and I watched my father move through his own backyard like a king, surveying a kingdom he'd built with his bare hands. He laughed loud at other men's jokes. He put his hand on Linda's back in that performative way people do when they know cameras are near. Someone asked him how business was going, and he said something about a strong quarter, about expansion, about the family legacy he was so proud to carry forward. I remember standing there with Emma on my hip, watching him say the word legacy and feeling my stomach turn over. Eleanor moved through the crowd like smoke, quiet, observant, greeting old acquaintances with a warmth that didn't reach her eyes. She wasn't there to eat canapes. She was cataloging. I watched her gaze move from the yacht to the pool house to the new wing being added onto the east side of the property, and I watched her do the math the same way Daniel had done it back at the office, translating square footage and marble countertops into missing deposits, missing years, missing dollars that should have been formula and daycare, and a car that didn't threaten to die on the interstate. At some point Linda spotted me and came over, champagne in hand, her smile arriving a half second before her eyes did the way it always had. "Vivian," she said, looking me up and down. Still in uniform, I see. Didn't have time to find something appropriate. This is appropriate, I said. It's what I wear to work. She laughed like I'd made a joke, though I hadn't, and drifted off toward a cluster of women in linen dresses. I stood there a moment longer, holding my daughter, feeling every bit the outsider I'd always been at these gatherings, and then Eleanor was at my elbow, her hand light on my arm, steering me gently toward the shade of a large oak at the edge of the yard, away from the noise. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. "How have you actually been managing Vivian, not the version you tell people, the real one?" I hesitated. I'd spent so many years perfecting the art of not being a burden, of answering fine whenever anyone asked, that the question itself felt foreign, like being handed a key to a door I'd forgotten existed. So I told her. I told her about clipping every coupon that came through the mail, about buying Formula A can at a time, instead of in bulk, because I couldn't afford the bulk price, even though it would have saved money in the long run. I told her about wearing the same 3 uniforms in rotation and hand-mending them myself rather than replacing them. I told her about the nights I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces that never quite fit, deciding which bill could wait another week. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, I looked over and saw that her eyes were wet, actual tears, standing at the rims of a woman I had never once in 28 years seen cry. "I let this happen," she said. "I trusted him. I stopped asking questions because I assumed a father wouldn't." She stopped herself, pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth, composed herself the way I imagined she'd composed herself through every hard boardroom decision of her life. "I am so sorry, Vivian. I should have checked. I should have known." "You didn't do this," I told her, and I meant it even through the ache sitting heavy in my chest. "He did." She looked back out at the party, at her son laughing under the string quartet's music. At the yacht, rocking gently against the dock. Bought, we both now understood, with money that should have kept his own granddaughter fed. Something hardened in her face, some final piece of denial finally giving way to resolve. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want him in a room, the whole family. I want him to explain every single dollar to my face in front of everyone who matters." I looked down at Emma, who'd woken and was watching the party with wide, unbothered eyes, too young to understand any of it, and I felt something settle in me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere close to both. "Okay," I said. "Let's do it." Eleanor called it a family dinner, which was in retrospect one of the more deliberate acts of theater I have ever witnessed from a woman who did not consider herself theatrical. She phrased the invitation to my father in exactly the right way, to guarantee he'd show up eager and unsuspecting. She told him she had an announcement to make about the future of Marshall Industries, and let him assume, as she'd intended, that the word future meant retirement, meant succession, meant him. I found out later that Richard had spent that entire day in high spirits. His assistant told Daniel, who told Eleanor, who told me with a flatness in her voice that made it clear she found no satisfaction in it, that he'd ordered a bottle of his best scotch sent up to his office that afternoon to celebrate early. He genuinely believed his mother was about to hand him the company outright. No more interim titles, no more acting CEO. He believed he'd finally arrived at the thing he'd been circling his whole life. The dinner was set at Eleanor's estate in the formal dining room with the long mahogany table that had hosted 3 generations of Marshall family gatherings, most of which I'd only heard about secondhand. I arrived early with Emma dressed simply no makeup because I had decided somewhere on the drive over that I wasn't going to perform for this room. I was going to sit in it as exactly who I was. Richard arrived looking like a man dressed for a coronation. A tailored navy suit, his hair freshly cut, that easy, confident smile he wore like a second skin whenever he thought he was winning. Linda was beside him in a deep emerald gown, diamonds at her throat, practically glowing with anticipated triumph. They both stopped short when they saw me seated already at the table, Emma in a portable bassinet beside my chair. "Vivian," my father said my name the way you'd greet an unexpected weather pattern. "I didn't know you'd be joining us." "Neither did I until yesterday," I said. Linda's eyes flicked toward the bassinet, then back to my face, her mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Still in the army, I take it. Goodness, how long has it been now? You'd think a nice desk job would have come along by now. I didn't answer her. I'd learned a long time ago that some comments deserve nothing but silence, that silence can be its own kind of armor. I simply looked at her until she looked away first and took my seat. Dinner began with the usual formalities, the staff moving quietly around the table, wine being poured, Richard telling a story about a golf outing with a state senator that nobody had asked to hear. I watched him laugh at his own jokes, and I felt Emma's small warm weight beside me, and I thought about every night I'd sat alone doing math at my kitchen table while he sat somewhere like this laughing entirely unbothered. Eleanor waited until the main course had been served, before she set down her fork with a small deliberate click against the china. "Richard," she said, and something in her tone made the whole table go quiet, even the staff seeming to sense it and step back toward the walls. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly in front of everyone at this table." He set down his own fork, still smiling, still entirely unsuspecting. "Of course, Mother. Anything. How much does Vivian receive every month from her trust?" He answered without a beat of hesitation, the number rolling off his tongue, like something he'd said 1,000 times before, which I would soon understand he probably had to auditors and accountants and anyone else who'd ever asked. $200,000. Same as it's always been. Eleanor turned to look at me, though she already knew what I was going to say because we'd rehearsed nothing. But she'd asked me the same question in the car on the way here, wanting to hear it once more before this moment. "Vivian, is that true?" I set my napkin down beside my plate and looked at my father. Really looked at him, searching his face for some flicker of the man I used to hope he could still become. "No," I said. "I've never received a single dollar of it. Not once, not ever." The silence that followed had weight to it, a physical pressure in the room. Linda's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Richard let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind of laugh people use when they're buying themselves a second to think. "That's Vivian, that's not accurate. There's clearly been some kind of mix-up with the bank, or the accountant made an error somewhere in the paperwork. I'll have someone look into it first thing tomorrow." "Which bank?" Richard. Eleanor's voice cut through his sentence like a blade through silk. "Which accountant? Give me a name right now, and I will call them myself tonight, and we will resolve this misunderstanding together." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I watched something behind his eyes scramble for footing and find none. That was when Daniel stepped through the dining room doors, exactly on cue, carrying a stack of files so thick it took both arms to hold, and set them down on the table with a heavy final sound that seemed to echo off the walls. "These are the disbursement records for the Marshall Family Trust," Daniel said, calm and clinical, the way a surgeon might describe an incision. 10 years of transfers, all authorized under Richard Marshall's signature, routed through 4 separate shell entities, none of which trace back to any account belonging to Vivian Marshall. Linda's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Richard stared at the files, like they were something venomous. This is a misunderstanding," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier polish, gone thin and unsteady. "I can explain every one of these." "Then explain," Eleanor said. "I'm listening. We're all listening." I watched a bead of sweat trace down the side of my father's temple, watched his hand tremble slightly as it reached for his water glass, watched 30 years of careful image building begin right there at that table to come apart at the seams. Daniel opened the first folder with the unhurried precision of a man who had been waiting a long time to do exactly this. He laid the pages out one at a time, turning them so Eleanor and, by extension, the rest of us could see every line. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, emails between my father and a compliance officer at one of the shell entities. An officer, Daniel explained, who turned out to be a former college roommate of my father's, more than willing to sign off on paperwork in exchange for a modest monthly retainer that had itself been quietly pulled from the same trust. "The Hartwell Consulting Group," Daniel said, tapping a page, "formed the same month Vivian turned 18. No offices, no employees beyond a registered agent. Its sole function, as far as I can determine, was receiving disbursements meant for Vivian and redirecting them minus a small administrative fee into accounts controlled by Richard." My father's mouth opened and closed. He looked for the first time in my adult life genuinely small, like the tailored suit had suddenly become several sizes too large for the man wearing it. The yacht, Daniel continued unmoved, was purchased 8 years ago for $4.2 million, financed in part through a loan collateralized against Hartwell's assets. The East Wing renovation on the house, completed last spring, ran approximately $1.6 million. The private jet lease. That's enough, Richard said, his voice cracking on the second word. I don't need you to read me an inventory of my own life. Then perhaps you'd like to explain it yourself, Eleanor said. Her hands, I noticed, were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale, and yet her voice never rose, never once cracked. There was something almost unbearable about her composure, the way grief and fury can sometimes look identical from the outside, both of them held perfectly still because moving might shatter something. Richard tried. God, I'll give him that much, he tried. He said something about market downturns, about a bridge loan he'd always intended to repay, about complicated tax structuring that he swore was designed to protect the trust from liability. But every sentence collapsed under its own weight before he could finish it, because there was no version of the story that explained why, in 10 years, not $1 had ever reached the daughter it belonged to. I sat very still through all of it. Emma's small hand curled around my finger where I'd reached into the bassinet without quite realizing I was doing it. I wasn't looking at the documents anymore. I was looking at my father's face, searching it the way I had searched it my whole life for some sign that he saw me, actually saw me, and not just the inconvenient reminder of a wife he'd lost too young, and a responsibility he'd never wanted. Linda broke first, oddly enough, not Richard. She set down her wine glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady and said very quietly to no one in particular, "I told him this would come out eventually." The table went silent in a new way. Richard turned to look at her, something like betrayal flashing across his face, as though her admission had wounded him more than the documents had. "You knew," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Linda didn't answer, which was in itself the only answer anyone needed. Eleanor stood then slowly, the way a woman stands when she has finally made peace with a decision she didn't want to make but can no longer avoid. She looked at her son with an expression I can only describe as grief wearing the mask of authority. "Richard, effective immediately, you are removed as acting CEO of Marshall Industries. Your access to all company accounts will be suspended tonight. I am instructing Daniel to file for a full accounting and freeze on any assets connected to Hartwell Consulting Group and its affiliated entities pending a complete restitution to your daughter. And I will personally be pursuing this through the courts if that is what it takes to make her whole. Mother—" His voice broke entirely on the word. "Please, I can fix this. Give me time, I can pay it back, I can—" "You had 10 years, Eleanor said. 10 years, Richard, while your own child rationed formula for her daughter and mended her uniforms by hand because she couldn't afford new ones. You don't get more time, you get consequences." He turned to me then, and for one unguarded second I saw something in his face that might have been genuine, not performance, not damage control, just a man finally confronting the size of what he'd done. "Vivian," he said, and his voice had gone hoarse, stripped of all its usual smoothness. "I'm sorry, I don't know how to make this right, but I am so sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about every night I'd told myself that struggling was simply what my life was supposed to look like, that I had no right to expect more, that maybe I'd somehow earned this distance he'd kept from me since my mother died. I thought about Emma sleeping peacefully beside me, entirely unaware that the man across the table had built an empire on the exact kind of hardship she and I had lived through every single day. "I didn't lose money," I said, finally, quiet, steady, the words coming out clearer than I expected. "I lost a father, a long time before tonight. Tonight just made it official." Nobody said anything after that. Richard sat there with his head bowed, his shoulders curved inward, like something inside him had finally given out. Linda stared at her plate. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, still and resolute, and Daniel quietly began gathering the documents back into their folder, the sound of the papers shuffling the only noise in a room that had just an hour earlier been full of easy laughter and champagne. I reached down and touched Emma's small hand, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. After everything, that whatever happened next, whatever the courts decided, the truth was already out. And nothing my father said now could put it back where it had been hidden for 10 long years. The lawsuit moved faster than I expected, though Daniel warned me from the beginning that white-collar cases with this much documentation rarely stayed quiet for long. Within weeks, local news picked up the story, Marshall Industries heir accused of decade-long theft from own daughter. One headline read, and I remember sitting in my small on-post housing unit, Emma asleep in the next room, scrolling through the article on my phone, with a strange hollow feeling, like reading about a stranger who happened to share my last name. Richard tried through his own attorneys to settle before it ever reached a courtroom. Daniel relayed the offers to me one at a time, a lump sum, then a larger lump sum, then finally an offer that included a public apology and a proposed reconciliation, as though money and a press statement could undo a decade of quiet, deliberate deception. I turned each one down, not out of spite. I want to be clear about that because I know how this can look from the outside, like a daughter chasing her father's downfall for the satisfaction of it. That wasn't what this was. I turned the offers down because settling meant sealing the records, meant no public accounting of what had actually happened. And I had spent too many nights doing math at my kitchen table, wondering why I could never make ends meet to let the truth get quietly folded back into a filing cabinet somewhere. The trial itself lasted 6 days. I sat in the gallery most of those days in my dress uniform because somewhere along the way it had stopped feeling like a costume and started feeling like armor, like a reminder to myself and to the room of exactly who I was and what I had built with my own 2 hands, while all of this had been happening without my knowledge. The prosecution, Eleanor's legal team, though, by that point, it had become something closer to a shared pursuit of the truth between grandmother and granddaughter, called witness after witness. A forensic accountant walked the jury through the shell company structure with a patience that made the fraud almost unbearably clear, chart after chart, showing money moving from the trust into Hartwell Consulting, out again into personal accounts, and finally into the physical, tangible things my father had built his life around. The yacht, the house, a vacation property in Aspen I hadn't even known existed until Daniel's team uncovered the deed. A former bookkeeper for Hartwell testified, visibly uncomfortable, that she'd raised concerns twice about the structure of the payments and had been told both times that it was simply how the family preferred to manage its affairs. She said she hadn't known where the money originally came from, that she'd assumed it was ordinary corporate consulting fees, until federal investigators contacted her the previous month. I testified too on the 4th day. I remember Daniel had prepared me, carefully walked me through what to expect, told me the defense would likely try to paint the whole thing as a misunderstanding, or worse, suggest that I'd somehow been complicit, benefiting quietly from arrangements I claimed not to know about. But when I actually sat in that witness chair, none of the preparation mattered as much as just telling the truth. I talked about WIC vouchers and double shifts. I talked about a car with a check engine light I couldn't afford to diagnose. I talked about mending the same 3 uniforms year after year because new ones weren't in the budget. I didn't cry. I'd promised myself I wouldn't, not in that room, not in front of him. I just told the truth plainly, the way you learn to give a report in the Army, clear, factual, no embellishment needed, because the facts spoke for themselves. Richard's attorneys tried in cross-examination to suggest I'd been aware of the trust all along and had simply chosen a modest lifestyle out of some kind of principle. I looked directly at the jury when I answered that one. If I'd known $200,000 a month was sitting somewhere with my name on it, I said my daughter would have never gone a single day without everything she needed. I wouldn't have had to choose between rent and formula. No one chooses to live that way when they don't have to. By the 6th day, there wasn't much left for either side to argue. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alvarez, who had listened to 6 days of testimony without so much as a raised eyebrow, delivered her ruling in a courtroom so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. She found Richard Marshall in clear breach of his fiduciary duty as trustee. She found evidence of deliberate, sustained fraud spanning 10 years. She ordered full restitution of the stolen funds, with interest calculated back to the date of each missing disbursement, along with additional damages for the financial hardship I'd endured. Linda, it turned out, had knowingly benefited from funds she understood to be improperly diverted, and the court ordered a significant portion of her personal assets seized as well. The house and the yacht both slated for liquidation to satisfy the judgment. I watched my father's face as the ruling was read. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He just sat there at the defense table with his head slightly bowed, looking for the first time since I'd known him like an old man, rather than the polished, confident figure who'd walked into that dinner weeks earlier expecting to be handed a company. As the courtroom emptied, he turned in his seat and looked at me one last time, something desperate and pleading in his expression, like he wanted me to say it was going to be all right, that we'd find our way back to something resembling a family. I didn't look away, but I didn't move toward him either. I simply stood, gathered my things, and walked out of that courtroom into the daylight, leaving him sitting there with the ruin he'd built for himself. A year passed, the way years do when you're rebuilding something slowly, and then all at once when you look up and realize how far you've come. I stayed in the army. People asked me more than once why I hadn't gotten out, hadn't taken the money, and built the kind of life the settlement could easily have afforded me. I understood the question. I just never had a good answer that satisfied them, because the truth was simple and didn't need much explaining. I loved what I did, and I had built it myself, and I wasn't going to let anyone's theft or anyone's guilt money decide who I was going to become. The restitution came through in full about 8 months after the trial, with interest, exactly as the judge had ordered. It was more money than I had ever imagined having in my life, more than I'd known how to think about, honestly sitting there in a bank account with my name on it for the first time. I didn't buy a house on a hill. I didn't buy a boat. I sat with Emma one evening, the two of us on the floor of our small on-post housing unit, and I thought about every night I'd rationed formula, every uniform I'd mended by hand, and I understood exactly what I wanted that money to become. I set up 3 funds. The first was a scholarship program for children of enlisted service members, the kind of support I would have given almost anything for growing up watching my own path narrow under the weight of money I never had. The second was an emergency assistance fund for military families facing exactly the kind of hardship I'd lived through: help with childcare, help with car repairs, help with the 100 small emergencies that can knock a young family sideways when there's no cushion underneath them. The third, the one that mattered to me most, in a way I still find hard to fully put into words, was a fund to help cover formula and infant nutrition costs for military families on posts across the country, so that no other young mother would ever have to stand in a commissary line doing the same painful math I used to do. Eleanor transferred full control of Marshall Industries to an outside executive board within the year, stepping back from the company her husband had built, not because the fraud had broken her faith in the family name, but because, as she told me one evening over tea at her estate, she'd realized somewhere in all of this that legacy was never supposed to be about a company at all. I spent so many years thinking the business was the thing I needed to protect, she said, watching Emma toddle across her sitting room floor, chasing a beam of afternoon light. I understand now it was never the business, it was you. Richard, as far as I know, lives quietly now in a modest condo 2 states away, working some ordinary job I've never asked the details of. Linda left him not long after the settlement, which surprised no one who had watched her carefully during the trial. He wrote me a letter about 6 months ago, the first real letter he'd ever written me in my entire life, asking simply to see me, to see his granddaughter, to have even a small chance to be something better than he'd been. I read it twice. I still haven't answered it. I'm not sure yet if I will, and I've stopped feeling guilty about not knowing. Some doors take longer to decide about than others, and I've learned I'm allowed to take my time. What I know for certain is this: I sit on the porch some evenings now watching Emma chase fireflies in the yard of the house I bought myself with my own name on the deed purchased with money I earned, and money that was finally rightfully returned to me. She's older now, running instead of crawling, laughing in that unguarded way. Small children laugh before the world teaches them to be careful with their joy. I watch her, and I think about the woman I want her to become. And I know it has nothing to do with the number in any bank account. She'll inherit honesty before she inherits money. I told Eleanor once, and I meant every word of it. Because money, I learned the hard way, can be stolen, hidden, funneled through shell companies and false signatures for 10 quiet years without anyone ever knowing. But the kind of person you choose to be, the kind of mother, the kind of soldier, the kind of family you build out of nothing but stubbornness and love that no one can ever take from you. Some mornings I still put on my uniform before the sun comes up, check on Emma sleeping soundly down the hall, and walk out into that quiet golden light feeling like the luckiest woman alive. Not because of what I have now, but because of who I refused to let this make me. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live it, I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below and tell me what part of this journey hit you hardest. We share stories like this every single day. Real stories about family, about resilience, about the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life from the ground up. So if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and hit subscribe right now. Let's keep walking this road together, one story at a time.